Well, I think I'm right in saying that you did your PhD on Shelley, although I don't think you finished it. So I assume you've always loved poetry.
I have always loved poetry. I mean, I chose Shelley for purely pragmatic reasons in that there was a huge archive at Oxford and my professor at university was a Shelley expert, so he just steered me there. I mean, I don't have a great love of Shelley, even though I find him a very interesting man. But I've always, the first writers I met were poets, funnily enough. And so first writers I became friendly with were poets like Andrew Motion and Craig Raine, Alan Hollinghurst, who was a poet at the time. So I read a vast amount of poetry. I buy a lot of poetry, contemporary poetry, largely 20th century. But having taught English literature for 10 years at Oxford, I have read my way through the canon. And it's a real pleasure, and I think a lot of novelists actually love poetry and read a lot of poetry.
Yeah, and I imagine you've chosen a contemporary poet for us.
Yes,
today.
I've chosen a poem by one of my top 5 favourite 20th century poets, Elizabeth Bishop, American poet, gay, long dead, a drunk as well, but a fascinating woman and a brilliant poet, but who only published about 70 poems in her lifetime.
This is post-World War II.
Post-World War II, 1950s and 60s largely. But she's actually, and this is Americans might not like this, but she's actually a very English poet in the sense that it's all about meter and rhythm and word choice, and she was a perfectionist. That tiny output, 4 books of poetry, 70 published poems. She sometimes spent years on a poem, and they're honed to absolute perfection. And this one I'm going to read is called Sandpiper. It's one of her later poems, but it's again, it probably took her 3 years to write. It's only 5 stanzas long. Sandpiper by Elizabeth Bishop. The roaring alongside he takes for granted, and that every so often the world is bound to shake. He runs to the south, finical, awkward, in a state of controlled panic, a student of Blake. The beach hisses like fat. On his left, a sheet of uninterrupting water comes and goes and glazes over his dark and brittle feet. He runs straight through it, watching his toes. Watching, rather, the spaces of sand between them, where, no detail too small, the Atlantic drains rapidly backwards and downwards as he runs. He stares at the dragging grains. The world is a mist, and then the world is minute and vast and clear. The tide is higher or lower. He couldn't tell you which. His beak is focused. He is preoccupied. Looking for something. Poor bird, he is obsessed. The millions of grains are black, white, tan and grey, mixed with quartz grains, rose and amethyst.
Full of extraordinary detail. And you, as you say, you couldn't tell she was an American poet.
No, it's. I think that's why she's loved by English poets. I mean, I think it's precision of language is what I think distinguishes English, British poetry from American poetry. And all the poets I like, I go to because their precision of language is so acute. And as a novelist, of course, you want to be as precise as you possibly can, but you simply can't do a whole novel like a poem. So there are bits of novels I think that are as well written as poetry, but the poet in his or her few stanzas really, I think, has a duty to get the right words in the right order, which is, I think, Coleridge's definition of poetry.